The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely looks dramatic at first. Sometimes it looks like your own son grabbing the car keys, mumbling, "I'll be right back," and leaving you standing alone at the San Francisco Ferry Terminal at 9:43 on a cold Thursday morning with nothing but a paper cup of burnt coffee and a wallet in your jacket pocket. My bag was already halfway to Sausalito by then. And if Captain Margaret Harlow hadn't stopped in the middle of boarding, squinted at me, and said, "Valor Woods, you used to investigate ferry accidents, didn't you?" Well, this story would have ended very differently. But stay with me here because what my son Ethan didn't realize was that he'd just stranded the one man on that dock who knew exactly how to ruin his plan. Before we go further, tell me something down in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy real family drama stories with quiet revenge and hard-earned lessons, subscribe to the channel and settle in. This one gets personal. I've lived in Northern California long enough to know that the waterfront can fool you. At 7 in the morning, San Francisco looks soft, peaceful even. The fog rolls over the bay like somebody spilled milk across glass, and the ferries drift through it slow and quiet, while tourists stand around pretending they're in a movie. But the bay lies to people. It always has. I learned that 38 years ago when I started working marine transportation investigations for the state. Sounds fancy when you say it fast. In reality, it meant I spent most of my career standing in cold engine rooms smelling diesel fuel while listening to angry captains explain why safety procedures were apparently optional. You'd be amazed how many disasters begin with a man saying, "Relax, I know what I'm doing." That sentence alone probably paid for my house in Vallejo. Nothing special, by the way. Small two-bedroom place off Redwood Parkway with faded green shutters and a garage door that groans like it's personally offended every morning. I bought it in 1998 for $211,000, which sounds adorable now if you know California housing prices. I still drive my old silver 2011 Ford Escape. Still keep peppermints in the center console. Still use paper road maps because GPS has betrayed me emotionally at least 6 times. And yes, I know how old that makes me sound. My son Ethan reminds me constantly. "Dad," he told me once staring at the folded highway map in my glove compartment like it was a dinosaur fossil. "You know, your phone does all this now, right?" "Yeah," I said. "And when the battery dies, my map doesn't suddenly decide we're driving into the Pacific Ocean." He rolled his eyes so hard I thought the boy might see his own brain. That was Ethan, 39 years old, sharp jawline, expensive haircut. Too much confidence for a man who leased a BMW he couldn't comfortably afford. You know the type. Always in a hurry, always checking his phone, always acting like every conversation was delaying him from becoming rich. Now I need you to understand something before we go further. Ethan wasn't evil. That would actually make this easier. He wasn't some movie villain sitting in dark rooms plotting against his elderly father while lightning flashed outside. No, Ethan was something much more real and much more common. He was impatient, and impatience mixed with money problems can turn otherwise decent people into strangers, especially when pride gets involved. I started noticing changes after his divorce 2 years earlier. Before that, Ethan used to call me every Sunday morning around 9. We'd talk football, complain about gas prices, argue about barbecue. Normal father-son stuff. Then came the divorce lawyers. Then the condo payments. Then the startup investment that absolutely couldn't fail, which is apparently what every failing investment says right before exploding. After that, conversations became shorter, more transactional. He stopped asking how I was doing and started asking whether I still had the old savings bonds Mom left behind. Subtle things. Little things. But when you spend 4 decades investigating accidents, you develop instincts about people. Tiny details start glowing like warning lights. A delayed answer, a forced smile, someone avoiding eye contact during simple questions. Those details matter. That Thursday morning started with Ethan picking me up at exactly 8:12 a.m. in his dark blue BMW X5. The passenger side floorboard was covered with receipts, protein bar wrappers, and a gym bag that smelled like regret. He tapped the steering wheel impatiently while I buckled my seatbelt. "You ready?" he asked. "I'm 62. Not 97, I told him. "I can still enter vehicles independently." He smirked a little at that. That's the thing that still bothers me sometimes. There were moments that morning where he looked like my son again. Not the stressed out businessman version, just Ethan, the kid who used to spill orange soda on my fishing gear. The teenager who failed his driver's test twice because he forgot stop signs weren't suggestions. The 23-year-old who once called me at midnight because he locked himself out wearing nothing but gym shorts. People don't become strangers all at once. It happens in pieces. That morning, he told me we were heading to Sausalito to meet a potential investor connected to his logistics company. Apparently, the man owned several commercial warehouse properties near Oakland. Big opportunity, Ethan kept saying while merging onto Interstate 80. If this works, it changes everything. I noticed he said for me less often these days. Now it was always for us. That's another thing investigators notice. Pronouns. Us can become dangerous when money enters the room. Still, I agreed to go because transportation logistics was my field once upon a time, and Ethan liked bringing me along whenever he needed someone older in the room to make him appear trustworthy. You think I'm joking? I'm not. At one point, he actually told me people trust gray hair, Dad. I said, good. Maybe borrow some character while you're at it. That made him laugh so hard he nearly missed the ferry building exit. See, we still had moments. That's what makes the story hurt. Traffic near the Embarcadero was terrible as usual. Tourists wandering into crosswalks like confused cattle. Cyclists ignoring every law known to mankind. A man wearing a full Spider-Man costume arguing with a parking officer beside a hot dog cart. San Francisco before 9 a.m. is basically organized chaos. Ethan parked near the ferry terminal garage on Vallejo Street, muttering about parking prices. $36 for 2 hours, he complained. This city's insane. You spent $11 on cold brew yesterday, I reminded him. That's different. It literally isn't. He grabbed his leather messenger bag and stepped out. I reached into the back seat for my navy duffel bag, the one with my medication wallet, backup phone charger, extra jacket, and an old yellow notebook I'd carried since 2004. That notebook matters later, by the way. Pay attention to that part. Anyway, Ethan was already halfway toward the terminal entrance while I locked the car. Typical. The morning air smelled like salt water and coffee beans drifting from the ferry plaza shops. Seagulls screamed overhead like tiny angry landlords. People in business suits hurried past carrying laptops and overpriced smoothies, and standing there beside Pier 3 watching my son rush ahead without once checking whether I'd caught up. I felt something uncomfortable settle in my chest. Not fear exactly, recognition. The kind you get right before an accident happens. And unfortunately, instincts like mine are rarely wrong. There's a particular look people get when they're hiding financial panic. If you've never seen it before, it's hard to explain. It's not fear exactly. Fear is honest. Fear sweats. Fear shakes. Financial panic is quieter. It makes people overly cheerful, overly confident. They start talking too fast, making promises nobody asked for, laughing half a second too late after jokes that weren't funny in the first place. And Ethan had that look all morning. We stepped into the ferry building around 8:47, and he immediately started checking his phone again, thumb moving fast, jaw tight, eyes distracted. Everything okay? I asked. Yeah. Investors just running late. Mm-hmm. That little sound I made, investigators use it a lot. It means I don't believe you, but please continue embarrassing yourself. Ethan shoved his phone into his coat pocket and motioned toward the Blue Bottle coffee stand near the north corridor. You want coffee? You offering to pay? He stared at me. I stared back. Finally, he sighed dramatically and said, You know what? Forget I asked. I laughed at that one. See, that's what I mean. The morning wasn't all darkness and betrayal. There were still pieces of normal life scattered around the edges. That almost makes it worse when things fall apart. We sat near the windows overlooking the bay while commuters rushed past us carrying briefcases and backpacks. A woman in running gear nearly spilled iced coffee on a businessman yelling into an AirPod. Somewhere behind us, a little kid cried because his croissant looked sad. Only in San Francisco can a pastry apparently experience emotional collapse. Ethan kept glancing toward the ferry schedule board. 8:55 departure to Sausalito. That was our ferry. He checked his watch 3 times in under a minute. That's another tell, by the way. People under pressure become obsessed with time because they secretly feel like they're running out of it. I stirred too much cream into my coffee and watched him carefully. You remember Carla? I asked casually. His shoulders stiffened almost immediately. That told me everything. Carla was his ex-wife. Good woman. Elementary school teacher in Marin County. Smart enough to leave before Ethan's financial problems became her financial problems too. Why are we talking about Carla? He asked. No reason, just wondering how she's doing. She's fine. You still talk. Sometimes. Lie. You know that look people get when they answer too quickly? That one. I leaned back in the chair and let silence do the work. Silence is incredibly useful. Most people rush to fill it, especially guilty people. Sure enough, Ethan started talking again almost immediately. Look, things have just been stressful lately, all right? There it is, I said. There, what is the real sentence? He frowned. I took another sip of coffee. Terrible coffee, by the way. $4.25 for something tasting vaguely like burned almonds should honestly qualify as fraud. You've been acting strange for months, I told him. You don't call unless you need something. You're distracted all the time. You barely sleep. I'm building a company, Dad. You're drowning. That hit him harder than I expected. His face changed instantly, defensive, angry. Why does everybody think they know my life better than I do? Because you look exhausted. I'm fine. Again, with the investigator sound. He rubbed his forehead hard enough to wrinkle the skin. You know what the problem is, he snapped quietly. You spent your whole life working safe government jobs, so you think everybody else should settle too. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was such a spectacular misunderstanding of who I was. People hear state transportation investigator and imagine paperwork, clipboards, retirement plans. What they don't picture are the storms, the accident scenes, the nights standing on damaged ferries at 2 in the morning trying to figure out why 14 people nearly died because some idiot skipped maintenance inspections. There's nothing safe about spending your life around men who believe rules are optional. I looked out the window at the bay for a second before answering. Ethan, I said calmly, I once spent 16 straight hours interviewing a ferry operator who lied about engine failure because he was secretly gambling away maintenance money. He blinked. I'm not afraid of risk. I continued. I'm afraid of arrogance. There's a difference. That landed. He looked away first, and there it was again. That strange mixture of shame and frustration people get when they know you're right, but desperately wish you weren't. For a moment, neither of us talked. Outside, the fog had started lifting from the water. Sunlight reflected off the bay in sharp silver streaks. A gull landed on the railing near the dock and stared directly at a tourist eating sourdough bread like it was planning a robbery. Honestly, that bird probably succeeded too. Ethan finally sighed. I just need this deal to work. What deal exactly? He hesitated. Too long. There's a warehouse investor interested in partnering with us. Us, my logistics company. You own 2 delivery vans and a rented office. It's scaling. Is that what the debt collectors call it now? That earned me a glare. I know. I probably should have been gentler. But here's the problem with fatherhood. Nobody tells you about, eventually, your kids become adults, but part of you still remembers teaching them how to tie shoes. So when they start making catastrophic decisions, your brain short circuits between treating them like grown men and wanting to confiscate their car keys. Ethan checked his phone again. No message, no investor, no miracle. And suddenly something clicked in my head. Tiny detail. Easy to miss. But remember what I told you earlier, I spent decades studying inconsistencies for a living. Ethan, I said slowly, what's the investor's name? Another pause. Richard. That's not a last name. Richard Talbot. You Googled him in front of me last night. No, I didn't. You absolutely did. His eyes narrowed. I stayed calm. You searched Richard Talbot Oakland Warehouse at 11:16 p.m. because your phone auto-connected to my Wi-Fi and displayed the search suggestion on the television screen. That's when Ethan made the mistake greedy people always make. He underestimated an old man because the old man spoke softly. You notice weird things, he muttered. That's literally what they paid me for. Now he looked irritated instead of nervous. Dangerous shift. Impatience was taking over. Look, he said, standing up suddenly. We're going to miss boarding. We still have 8 minutes. How would you know that I pointed at the departure clock without looking? Because your ferry leaves at 8:55, loading closes at 8:52, and they delayed departure 3 minutes because the maintenance crew's still unloading supply crates. He stared at me. You can tell that from here. No, I said. I can tell because dock supervisor Luis Mendoza always unloads maintenance cargo on Thursdays before the commuter rush. Pause. You remember the dock supervisor's name? I remember everybody's name. And that right there was the first moment Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable all morning. Not angry, not impatient, uneasy. Because I think deep down he suddenly remembered something he'd forgotten. Old men become invisible to certain people, but invisible doesn't mean helpless. And unfortunately for Ethan, he was about to learn the difference the hard way. The strange part is this: I don't think Ethan originally planned to leave me behind. Not completely, anyway. I think he planned to accidentally separate from me for a few minutes. Maybe long enough to take a private meeting. Maybe long enough to hide something. Maybe long enough to keep me from hearing details he didn't want me hearing. But greed has a way of making people careless, and careless people make mistakes fast. Boarding started at exactly 8:51 a.m. A deckhand in a Navy windbreaker opened the gate while commuters shuffled forward holding coffee cups and backpacks. The bay wind cut through the terminal hard enough to sting my ears. Ethan suddenly became hyper-focused, too focused. He grabbed his messenger bag tighter against his side and started walking quickly toward the boarding line. Come on, he said over his shoulder. I bent down near the bench to zip my Navy duffel bag shut. The zipper always stuck halfway because the bag was ancient and probably held together through spite alone. Inside that bag was half my life: prescription medication, reading glasses, backup wallet, phone charger, a yellow spiral notebook full of handwritten investigation notes dating back almost 20 years, and a sealed envelope Ethan absolutely did not know about. That envelope matters later. Remember it. Anyway, I was still wrestling with the zipper when I noticed Ethan had already reached the gate without me. No glance backward, no checking whether I'd caught up, just moving, fast, impatient. A younger man might not have noticed anything strange there, but when you spend decades studying human behavior under stress patterns, become impossible to ignore. Ethan wasn't distracted. He was avoiding. I finally got the zipper closed and grabbed the bag handles. Hold up, I called. He waved vaguely without turning around. That bothered me more than I expected. You know that feeling when somebody you love suddenly treats you like excess luggage instead of a person? That. I moved toward the gate while commuters squeezed past me in both directions. Somewhere nearby, a ferry horn blasted low across the water. The smell of diesel drifted through the dock area. By the time I reached the boarding ramp, Ethan was already halfway onto the vessel. And then my phone buzzed. It was Sam Bennett. Now Sam has the supernatural ability to call at the worst possible moments. If I were being attacked by wolves, that man would somehow instinctively know to phone me and ask whether I'd tried the onion rings at some diner in Oakland. I answered anyway. Morning, old man Sam said immediately. You're older than me. By 4 months. Which means statistically, I'm wiser. That's not how statistics work. I slowed near the dock entrance while passengers continued boarding around me. Sam started talking about a fishing trip he wanted to plan near Monterey. Something about renting a boat with minimal chance of sinking, which honestly felt directed at my career history. And for maybe 20 seconds, life felt normal again. Then I looked up and saw Ethan disappear inside the ferry cabin doors, still without looking back once. Something cold settled in my stomach. Sam, I interrupted quietly. Yeah, my son's acting strange. That sentence could describe half the male population in California. No. I mean, strange. That got his attention. Sam had known Ethan since he was 11 years old. He used to help coach Ethan's Little League team back before knees and lower backs declared war on our generation. What happened? Sam asked. I kept my eyes on the ferry entrance. He's nervous, rushing, avoiding questions. You think he's in trouble? I think he's desperate. Long pause. That bad? I don't know yet. And right there, Right in the middle of that sentence, the boarding gate alarm beeped twice. The deckhand started closing access. I frowned. That was early. Hold on, I muttered, moving forward faster. The wind picked up sharply across the dock. Papers blew near the ticket kiosk. A woman wearing a Stanford hoodie chased a runaway scarf while yelling apologies to strangers. I reached the gate just as the deckhand locked the barrier. Sorry, sir, he said automatically. Boarding's closed. I blinked. What departure clearance? The ferry leaves in 4 minutes. Captain moved schedule up. That made no sense. Blue and Gold never adjusted departures without harbor notice. Unless... I looked past him toward the ferry windows, and there was Ethan, standing inside near the rear seating area, phone pressed to his ear, looking directly at me. Now pay attention to this next part, because it matters. For about 3 seconds, our eyes locked through that glass. And in those 3 seconds, my son did not look surprised to see me stranded outside. He looked relieved. That feeling in my stomach turned into concrete. I stepped toward the barrier. Ethan. He glanced away instantly. Not panic, not confusion, avoidance. The ferry engines rumbled louder beneath the dock. Sir, the deckhand warned politely, "You need to step back." I barely heard him. I was staring at my son, trying to understand what exactly I was seeing, because human beings can fake a lot of emotions. But relief. Relief is honest, and Ethan looked like a man whose problem had just solved itself. Then the ferry doors closed, just like that. My Navy duffel bag sat somewhere inside that vessel while I stood stranded on the dock holding nothing but a cooling coffee cup and my wallet. The ferry pulled away slowly at 8:54 a.m. I watched it drift into the bay while wind whipped across the terminal hard enough to water my eyes. And no, before you ask, I wasn't crying. I'm old, not dramatic. Also, the wind near Pier 3 is basically legally classified as assault. Still, standing there felt awful. Not because of the bag, not even because of the medication. Because for the first time all morning, I finally allowed myself to think the thing I'd been avoiding. My son might have done that on purpose. A young terminal employee with silver nose rings approached carefully. "You okay, sir?" "Depends," I muttered. She glanced toward the ferry disappearing into the fog. "Did somebody leave without you?" My son. Oof! That single word carried more sympathy than most therapy sessions. I actually laughed a little. "Yeah," I admitted. "Oof feels about right." She offered to help me contact ferry operations, but my phone battery was already down to 12%, and Ethan wasn't answering calls. Straight to voicemail. Again. And again. That's another thing investigators learn. People answer the phone when accidents happen. They ignore the phone when guilt happens. I started pacing slowly near the terminal windows, replaying the morning in my head piece by piece. The rushed behavior, the fake investor, the constant phone checking, the way Ethan avoided eye contact once boarding started. Then another realization hit me, sharp enough to stop me mid-step. The yellow notebook. My notebook was inside that bag. And inside that notebook were names, addresses, old shipping records, financial notes from investigations years earlier, most of it meaningless to ordinary people, but not all of it. One section involved commercial dock property ownership around Oakland and Alameda County, warehouse ownership, transportation contracts, hidden shell companies. Suddenly my pulse sped up, because Ethan's mysterious investor meeting no longer sounded random, not even close. And right as that thought settled into place, I noticed someone near the upper boarding deck staring directly at me. A woman in a Navy captain's coat. Tall, gray streaks and dark hair, sharp posture. She squinted for a moment. Then her eyes widened slightly, and she started walking toward me fast. The woman in the captain's coat stopped about 10 feet away from me and tilted her head slightly. "You're Valor Woods," she said. Not a question, a statement. Her voice carried that calm command tone people develop after years of managing emergencies around large machinery and impatient passengers. I stared at her for a second before recognition finally clicked into place. "Margaret Harlow," I said. And suddenly, I was standing 30 years in the past. Back when her hair was darker, My knees didn't sound like microwave popcorn. When I stood up and both of us worked accident investigations around the bay, she pointed at me immediately. I knew it. I told Luis that was you. She shook her head once. You got older. That's incredibly rude for 9 in the morning. And you still complain professionally, I see. There are standards to maintain. That got a laugh out of her. Not a polite laugh either. A real one. And honestly, I needed that more than I realized. Because until that moment, I'd been standing there feeling less angry than embarrassed. That's the ugly secret nobody talks about with family betrayal. Humiliation hurts almost more than the actual betrayal itself, especially in public. Margaret stepped closer and glanced toward the ferry already cutting through the bay. What happened? She asked. I opened my mouth, paused, then sighed. My son boarded with my bag still on the vessel. Her expression shifted instantly. Not judgment, recognition. You think it was intentional, I think. I rubbed the back of my neck slowly. I think he didn't mind that it happened. Now I need you to understand something about people who work transportation for decades. Captains, investigators, dock supervisors, ferry mechanics. We all develop the same face eventually. The I've seen human stupidity before face. Margaret had it immediately. You got medication in that bag? She asked. Yeah. Phone charger. Yep. Anything important? I hesitated. That caught her attention fast. Valor. Maybe. Define maybe. There's a notebook. What kind of notebook? The kind that might accidentally explain why my son suddenly became interested in Oakland warehouse investments. Now her eyes narrowed. There it was. The investigator brain activating. Margaret crossed her arms against the cold wind and studied me carefully. You want to start from the beginning? So I did. We moved toward a quieter section near the operations office while commuters rushed around us. Somewhere nearby, a loudspeaker announced delayed departures to Alameda. A gull landed on a trash can and aggressively stole half a muffin from an unsuspecting tourist. Nature is beautiful. Brutal, but beautiful. I explained everything. The mysterious investor, the rushed behavior, the fake confidence, the strange relief on Ethan's face when the ferry doors closed. Margaret listened without interrupting once. That's another thing experienced investigators learn. Silence gets people talking better than questions do. When I finished, she exhaled slowly through her nose. Okay, she said finally. First off, your son's an idiot. Appreciate the professionalism. I'm off duty in 12 minutes. I can insult civilians freely. That made me laugh harder than it probably should have. Then her face turned serious again. You said the notebook had property records. Old investigation notes. Most of it's harmless. Most. I looked out toward the water. Years ago, during a freight route fraud investigation, I'd uncovered several shell companies quietly buying dockside warehouse property through fake ownership groups. Perfectly legal on paper. Very illegal underneath. Money laundering, shipping fraud, hidden cargo routing, messy stuff. The investigation eventually disappeared into federal hands, which usually means one of two things happened. Either somebody important got arrested, or somebody important made phone calls. I kept copies of my notes anyway. Not because I planned to use them, because investigators don't throw away patterns. And lately Ethan had been asking strangely specific questions. About shipping routes, warehouse investors, dock permits. At first I assumed he was trying to impress me with industry knowledge. Now I wasn't so sure. Margaret caught the look on my face immediately. Oh no, she muttered. You think your son found out about those records? I think he found out enough to become interested. Jesus. Yeah. We stood there quietly for a moment while the wind pushed fog across the bay again. Then Margaret suddenly snapped into captain mode. All right, here's what we're going to do. I blinked. You seriously think I'm letting a 62-year-old man get stranded at my terminal because his son's having a midlife crisis? I appreciate how insulting and supportive that sentence was simultaneously. It's a gift. She pulled out a radio clip to her coat. Dispatch, this is Captain Harlow. I need confirmation on blue and gold commuter line 855 inbound. Static crackled back immediately. As she coordinated with terminal operations, I sat on a nearby bench and finally checked my phone battery again. 8%. Fantastic. I texted Ethan anyway. Call me. 3 dots appeared instantly, then disappeared. No reply. That tiny detail told me everything. He had his phone in his hand. He was choosing not to answer. Funny how silence becomes louder than words sometimes. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. Sam, tell me your son didn't actually abandon you, he said immediately. Well, the evidence currently suggests he's not winning Father of the Year. Oh my God. I could hear him standing up somewhere on the other end. Where are you, South Terminal Operations? I'm coming down there. You don't have to. I absolutely do. Also, I was halfway through pancakes when you called earlier, so now I'm emotionally invested. That man processes crises through breakfast foods, I swear to God. While waiting for Sam, I watched Margaret work. And here's something most people don't realize about experienced captains. The really good ones never look rushed, even during problems, especially during problems. Margaret moved through the terminal with calm precision, speaking quietly to staff, checking schedules, reviewing passenger logs. And watching her triggered something strange in me. Memory. Because for the first time all morning, I stopped feeling helpless. You spend enough years solving transportation disasters, and eventually your brain starts organizing chaos automatically. Patterns, timelines, human error. I started replaying Ethan's actions again, not emotionally, professionally. That changed everything. Margaret. I called suddenly. She turned. What berth did Blue and Gold use before departure? Dock 2. Temporary reassignment. Yeah, mechanical issue at Dock 4 earlier. I nodded slowly. That mattered. Because Ethan wouldn't have known the berth change unless somebody informed him ahead of time, meaning he'd either A, been communicating with terminal personnel beforehand, or B, been here earlier this week. Margaret saw the realization hit me. What? He planned this better than I thought. Her expression darkened immediately. How planned, I think my son knew exactly where that ferry would board before we arrived. Right then, Sam Bennett burst through the terminal doors wearing an old Marine's jacket and carrying a paper bag from Lou's Cafe. Only Sam would respond to a possible family conspiracy by bringing bacon sandwiches. He spotted me instantly. You look terrible, he announced. Good to see you too. Then he handed me a sandwich. Eat something before you start investigating your own child like Batman. I stared at him. You know, there are moments I genuinely treasure our friendship. I know, he said proudly. Now tell me why your son apparently turned into a low-budget criminal mastermind. And honestly, that was the exact moment I realized this situation was about to become much bigger than a forgotten bag. Sam Bennett has a face that somehow improves every bad situation while simultaneously making it worse. You know the type. The man could walk into a funeral carrying onion rings and somehow convince everybody it was emotionally necessary. He dropped onto the bench beside me, unwrapped his bacon sandwich, and looked between me and Margaret. So he said casually, "Which part are we at? Financial fraud, emotional betrayal, ferry-based kidnapping." Margaret blinked once. He always liked this. "Unfortunately," I said. Sam pointed at me with half a sandwich. "And yet you keep answering my phone calls." Curious. That actually got Margaret laughing again. I needed those moments more than I wanted to admit, because underneath the sarcasm and coffee and jokes, I was starting to realize something painful. My son hadn't just abandoned me physically. He'd underestimated me completely, and that part hurt deeper. Margaret leaned against the operations counter while reviewing passenger manifests on a terminal tablet. Blue and Gold Ferry should dock in Sausalito at 9:26, she said. If Ethan's carrying your bag off immediately, we may still have time to intercept before he disappears. Depends what he's looking for, I muttered. Sam looked at me sideways. You really think he's after those investigation notes? I think he's desperate enough to convince himself it's justified. Now here's the thing about desperation. It makes smart people stupid. Very stupid. Because desperate people stop thinking long-term. They focus only on immediate solutions. And Ethan had already made 2 massive mistakes. First mistake. He assumed I didn't notice details anymore because I was older. Second mistake. He forgot I spent most of my adult life investigating transportation fraud, meaning I knew exactly how impatient people behave under pressure. Margaret, I said suddenly, can you pull security footage from Dock 2 before departure? She looked up immediately. You think he tampered with something? No. I stood slowly. I think he panicked. That confused Sam. Aren't those opposite things? Not always. I started pacing near the operations desk while my brain worked backward through the timeline. Ethan rushing me. Ethan constantly checking his phone. Ethan knowing the birth change ahead of time. And then, the messenger bag. His bag, I muttered. Margaret frowned. What about it? He never let go of it, Sam shrugged. So Ethan's careless with everything except things he's afraid to lose. Now both of them were listening closely. That bag wasn't just business paperwork, I continued. He held it too tight all morning, kept checking the zipper, shifted it away whenever someone got close. Margaret crossed her arms. You think he's carrying financial documents? I think he's carrying debt. That landed hard, because debt changes posture. You'd be amazed what financial pressure does to the human body. People hunch protectively around secrets without realizing it. I'd seen it hundreds of times during investigations. And suddenly I remembered another detail. Tiny, ridiculous, but important. He wore mismatched socks, I said. Sam stared at me. What kind of Sherlock Holmes nursing home nonsense is that? Blue sock on the left, black sock on the right. You noticed your son's socks? I notice everything. Margaret nodded slowly, though she understood immediately. Rushed people make dressing mistakes. Panic leaks through details. He got dressed fast, she said quietly. Exactly. And if he got dressed fast, Sam started realizing it too. Then whatever happened this morning wasn't part of a calm plan I finished. That changed the entire situation. Because calm criminals are dangerous, panicked ones are sloppy. Right then, Margaret's radio crackled. Captain Harlow, incoming call from Sausalito Dock Operations. She grabbed the receiver immediately. Harlow. Pause. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. You're sure? Another pause. All right, keep eyes on him. She lowered the radio slowly and looked directly at me. Well, she said your son just upgraded from suspicious to spectacularly suspicious. My stomach tightened. What happened? He got off the ferry carrying your duffel bag and immediately started arguing with dock staff. Sam blinked. About what Margaret checked her notes. He wanted access to a restricted storage office. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The stupidity greed creates. See, Ethan didn't understand ferry terminals the way I did. Restricted dock offices aren't random rooms. They're monitored spaces tied to cargo routing and temporary storage records. And if he was trying to search my notebook privately, he'd picked the worst possible location. He's improvising, I muttered. Margaret nodded. Dock staff said he claimed his father worked transportation and he needed somewhere quiet for business paperwork. Sam let out a low whistle. Oh, buddy, that's dumb. Incredibly dumb, I agreed, because Ethan had just made another critical mistake. He used my name. Now I know some of you listening probably think, well, maybe he was just stressed. Maybe. But here's what you need to understand. People reveal their real intentions through unnecessary actions. Ethan didn't need private office access to carry a bag. He wanted isolation, privacy, time. And that meant one thing: he was searching for something specific. Margaret checked the terminal clock. 9:18 a.m. I can get us on the next ferry, she said. I looked at her. Us again. She pointed at me sharply. Valor. I spent 14 years working accident investigations with you. I know that face. What face? The one you get right before uncovering something ugly. Sam nodded immediately. Oh yeah, he gets all quiet and starts organizing invisible evidence in his head. Creepy as hell. It's not creepy. You once identified a drunk dock worker because his boot prints lacked emotional discipline. I pointed at him. They did. Margaret laughed so hard she had to steady herself against the counter. And for one weird little moment, standing inside that noisy ferry terminal with my son possibly stealing investigation records across the bay, I felt strangely okay. Not happy, not calm, but steady. That matters. Because panic spreads fast in families. One person loses control and everybody else follows. But experience does the opposite. Experience slows things down. And unfortunately for Ethan, slowing down was the last thing he wanted right now. Margaret arranged temporary boarding clearance while Sam kept eating like we weren't in the middle of a transportation-related family crisis. I'm just saying, Sam muttered through bacon. If your son turns out to be involved in organized crime, I'm going to need you to admit this is objectively interesting. He's not involved in organized crime. You don't know that yet. I hate how much confidence you have while being wrong. That's what friendship is. My phone buzzed suddenly. Finally. Ethan. I answered immediately. Where's my bag? No apology, no explanation, straight to the bag. That told me everything I needed. I stayed calm. Interesting first sentence. Long silence on the line. Then Dad listened carefully. I need you to tell terminal staff there was a misunderstanding. Ah, there it was. Fear. Real fear this time. Not stress. Not arrogance. Fear. I leaned against the railing overlooking the bay. Ethan, I said quietly, what exactly are you looking for inside my notebook? Dead silence. Behind me, Sam stopped chewing. Even Margaret looked up sharply. Then Ethan made the single dumbest mistake of the entire morning. He got angry. You kept records without telling anybody, he snapped. Do you have any idea what those documents are worth? Not important, not dangerous. Worth. Greed always exposes itself eventually. I closed my eyes briefly, because hearing your own son say something like that feels like discovering rot inside the walls of your house. You left me behind for paperwork, I asked softly. No, I just needed time. You stranded your father for shipping records. It's bigger than that, I know. And suddenly, I really did know. The warehouses, the fake investor, the panic, the restricted dock office. Ethan hadn't been trying to steal from me. He'd been trying to sell something he didn't fully understand. And judging by the fear in his voice, he'd already realized he'd made a terrible mistake. There's a moment in every investigation where the story changes shape. Before that moment, you're dealing with confusion. After it, you're dealing with motive. And standing there inside the ferry terminal with my phone pressed against my ear, listening to my son breathe too hard into the receiver, I finally understood the shape of the thing. This wasn't about curiosity. This wasn't about a careless mistake. Ethan believed those old shipping records could save him financially, which meant he was already in deeper trouble than I'd imagined. Who are you trying to sell the information to? I asked quietly. Dad? No. Don't dad me right now. Answer the question. Silence. Behind me, Margaret stood very still beside the operations desk while Sam watched my face carefully. Ethan lowered his voice. You don't understand how much money this could fix. There it was again. Could fix. That's how desperate people talk. Like money is medicine. Like one big transaction will magically repair years of bad decisions. I leaned against the terminal railing and looked out across the gray water. You know what your problem is? I asked him. You think I'm the problem? No. I think you keep mistaking shortcuts for solutions. His breathing sharpened immediately. You spent your whole life working safe jobs and judging people who actually took risks. I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because he still didn't get it. Even now, Ethan. I said carefully, I investigated maritime fraud for 27 years. Do you know what every major disaster had in common? No response. Some man in a hurry convinced himself rules no longer applied to him. He muttered something under his breath. What was that? I said. I don't have time for a lecture. There it is, I said softly. That irritated him immediately. What? The impatience. I'm standing in a dock office with your bag while people are waiting on me. My eyes narrowed. People. Plural. Important detail. Very important. Margaret saw my expression change instantly. She mouthed silently. What? I held up one finger. People. Not investor. Plural meant Ethan wasn't alone, and suddenly the entire situation tilted sideways in my head. Who's there with you? I asked calmly. Long pause. Too long. Then Ethan answered too quickly. Nobody. Lie. Clear lie. You know that tone people use when they realize they revealed something accidentally? That one. I straightened slowly. Ethan. What? Leave the office. I can't. Now my pulse sped up, not from panic, recognition, because he didn't say won't. He said can't. There's a difference, a huge one. I turned toward Margaret immediately. He's not alone. She grabbed her radio instantly. Dock operations confirm visual on office access near Sausalito berth. Static crackled. Then, two unidentified males entered approximately 4 minutes ago with passenger matching description. Sam muttered, "Well, that's deeply concerning." "No kidding." I took a slow breath and forced myself to think clearly. This is where experience matters most, by the way. Anybody can stay calm during easy situations. Real skill shows up when everything turns ugly. Ethan started talking fast again. "You need to listen to me carefully, all right? This isn't what you think. Then explain it. I met some people through the warehouse deal names." "Dad, please." "Names." He exhaled shakily, and right there I knew something important. My son was scared of them. Not nervous, scared. I spent decades interviewing witnesses after transportation crimes. Fear has a sound. It shortens sentences, tightens breathing, makes people glance around even during phone calls. Ethan sounded cornered. Margaret lowered her voice. "We may need harbor police." I nodded slightly but kept my attention on the call. "Ethan," I said carefully, "did you show them the notebook already?" "No." "Thank God. Did you tell them what's inside?" Another hesitation. "Some of it." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he had, because greedy people always oversell information before understanding its value. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. "Those records involve old federal investigations. Some names in there were never charged publicly." Dead silence. Then, "What?" "There are reasons certain files disappeared." "Ethan." Now I heard genuine panic. "You never told me that. You never asked." Behind me, Sam muttered quietly, "Oh, this is bad, bad." Yes, yes it was, because now I understood what had happened. Ethan found fragments of my old investigation notes weeks earlier while helping me clean garage storage boxes. He probably Googled some company names, realized certain warehouse properties were now worth millions. Then somebody connected him to buyers interested in old shipping records. And like every desperate man before him, he thought he could control people more dangerous than himself. That almost never ends well. "Are they threatening you?" I asked suddenly. Long pause. Then very softly. "Not directly. That means yes, by the way. People say not directly when they're already terrified." Margaret was moving now, full captain mode, coordinating routes, checking schedules, contacting Harbor Patrol quietly without causing panic. Watching her work reminded me why she'd been one of the best operations captains on the bay 20 years earlier. Calm, efficient, zero wasted motion. Meanwhile, Sam sat beside me eating the last piece of bacon like emotional support protein. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "No." "Good. Means you still care." That hit harder than I expected. Because he was right. If I didn't care about Ethan anymore, this would actually be easier. But love doesn't disappear just because disappointment arrives. That's the ugly part nobody prepares you for as a parent. You can be furious at your child and still want to protect them at the exact same time. The phone crackled again. "Dad?" His voice sounded smaller now, younger somehow. And suddenly I heard flashes of the boy he used to be. The 12-year-old scared of thunderstorms. The 16-year-old pretending not to cry after his first breakup. The exhausted 28-year-old holding his newborn daughter in the hospital. That's the brutal thing about parenthood. Your memories betray you during anger. "They just want the notebook," he whispered. I looked toward the bay. Fog rolled low over the water while another ferry sounded its horn in the distance. "No," I said quietly. "They want leverage." What's that supposed to mean? It means if those records matter enough to scare you, then they matter even more to them. Silence again. Then I heard another voice in the background. Male, sharp, impatient. "Tell him to hurry up." My stomach dropped instantly. Not because the man sounded dangerous, because he sounded comfortable. Comfortable people are the ones who've done this before. "Ethan," I said immediately. "Listen carefully. Do not hand over anything else. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. Those men already know you're desperate. That means they stopped respecting you the second you arrived. Margaret pointed toward the boarding gate. Next ferry arriving. Perfect timing. Sam stood immediately. Well, he said, brushing crumbs off his jacket, this officially became the weirdest breakfast interruption of my month. Month, I said. Fair point. Year. I started toward the boarding area beside Margaret while keeping the phone pressed tight against my ear. Dad. Ethan whispered suddenly, voice cracking slightly. I think I made a mistake. That sentence hurt more than all the others combined, because underneath the greed and arrogance and stupidity, he finally sounded honest. And honesty arriving this late usually means the damage has already started. The thing about panic is it spreads quickly. 1 second you're standing beside a calm captain, a friend eating bacon like the world isn't on fire, and the next you realize that the entire terminal is an ecosystem of stress. Every commuter rushing toward boarding lines, every deckhand trying to track luggage, every loudspeaker announcing delayed departures. And in the center of it all, your son, the supposed grown man trying to negotiate with people who actually know how the system works. Sam Bennett leaned against the railing next to me, shaking his head. I can't believe this. You literally wrote the manual they're all following and your kid's treating it like a video game. I smiled despite myself. You say that like it's funny, Sam. It's hilarious, he said with absolute certainty. And terrifying, but mostly hilarious. You know that look? The one where you're simultaneously laughing and groaning at the stupidity of someone you care about? That was me. Ethan had absolutely no idea what he'd gotten himself into. By now, Margaret was orchestrating a quiet ballet of terminal operations. She had staff repositioning barriers, contacting the Sausalito dock ahead, and subtly clearing the way for me to board the next ferry without drawing attention. Her movements were precise, calm, and utterly terrifying in their effectiveness. You never want someone like that against you. You want them on your side. Luckily for me, she was firmly in my corner. Sam, noticing my smirk, said, "You realize this is going to be a story we tell for decades, right?" "Not if we survive the morning," I replied. But the humor, the levity was necessary. It kept my mind sharp. You have to laugh when your son's potential financial ruin and your own embarrassment collide in public. Otherwise, panic would eat you alive. Meanwhile, Ethan was fumbling inside the ferry. He had dragged my Navy duffel bag with him, but instead of taking care, he shoved it behind a bench, attempting to hide it. Only problem: I had meticulously labeled every section, every notebook, every folder in that bag. I could reconstruct its contents from memory alone. That was my secret advantage, my hidden superpower. While he thought he was gaining leverage, I was already analyzing the entire scenario, predicting his next moves. "Dad?" Ethan whispered into the phone again, this time more anxious. "I think I miscalculated how serious this is." "You did more than miscalculate," I said softly. "You assumed I wouldn't notice your pattern of behavior. That was your first mistake." Margaret, overhearing me, glanced at me sharply and whispered, "You're not going to let him panic further, are you?" "Not if I can avoid it," I replied, scanning the ferry cabin from outside through the glass windows. Ethan, as you might imagine, is not subtle under pressure. His panic caused him to fidget excessively. He dropped receipts, shuffled papers, and shifted the bag repeatedly, exposing its contents to anyone who might glance too closely. The irony was delicious. The man had been confident when boarding, full of arrogance, convinced he was clever, and now his entire facade was unraveling. Sam, unable to resist commentary, muttered, "It's amazing how quickly hubris turns into chaos." I nodded. He was right. For years, I'd trained myself to notice the smallest deviations in human behavior: a tightened jaw, a flick of the eye, a shallow breath when someone thinks they're unobserved. And there it was in spades. Every tick of Ethan's movements broadcasted his guilt to the trained eye. I pressed the phone to my ear again. Ethan put down the bag, slowly. "And answer me honestly this time. Did you tell anyone else what's in it?" He hesitated, voice cracking. "No. Only them. Only them who... the people I thought could help me. The investors." I exhaled slowly. "That's your second mistake. You assume they understand what they're dealing with." He said nothing, and the silence was heavy. You know, the kind of silence that stretches long enough to make the terminal noise fade into white noise in your mind. That was this moment. Margaret moved forward, signaling for me to step toward the ferry. She had coordinated with the terminal staff so that I could board unnoticed. Timing was crucial. Ethan had little time before someone else intervened. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded. And then Sam did the impossible. He leaned over and whispered, "I'm glad I'm here for moral support. I'm also really hungry. Can I have that sandwich back after this?" I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Humor. It keeps you sane. I stepped aboard the ferry, carefully keeping my eyes on Ethan. He was trying to arrange papers inside the cabin like nothing was wrong, but his shaking hands betrayed him. Every instinct I had from decades in investigation screamed that the moment to act was now. "Ethan," I called firmly but calmly. He looked up, startled. "You're making a big mistake." His mouth opened, then closed. The fear was tangible now. Not just panic over me or the bag, but real deep-seated fear. I just wanted to fix things," he stammered. "You fix nothing," I replied. "You're in over your head and you don't even realize it." Margaret intercepted at the cabin door, standing firm. The authority she exuded made Ethan pause in a way that no reprimand from me could have achieved. "Sir," she said, voice calm but commanding. "Step aside and let the situation be managed safely. No one else needs to be endangered here." Ethan swallowed hard. He looked between Margaret and me, realizing the full weight of his predicament. "You don't understand," he shouted suddenly. "They're counting on me." I sighed. "Ethan, that's the problem. You think anyone is counting on you because you've convinced yourself that's the case. But the people who matter are right here, and you've underestimated all of us." The next few moments were a blur. Margaret coordinated with staff to secure my duffel bag, ensuring no documents could be lost. I kept my focus on Ethan, silently tracing every move he made. He tried to speak, gesturing at the bag, but his movements were sloppy, rushed. Sam, ever the commentator, whispered under his breath, "Oh, this is beautiful chaos. Like a Shakespearean tragedy, but with coffee and sandwiches." I chuckled, shaking my head. Chaos indeed, but controlled chaos. That's what experience buys you. While Ethan panicked, we operated precisely. Finally, Margaret retrieved my duffel bag and handed it to me. The relief on my face must have been obvious because Sam nudged me. "You look like a man who just solved world peace," he said dryly. "Something like that," I replied, slipping the bag over my shoulder. Ethan, meanwhile, was frozen in the corner of the cabin. His face was pale sweat beading at his hairline. For the first time that morning, he looked truly human. Vulnerable, afraid, exposed. And in that moment, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about a bag, or documents, or even greed. It was about control, about understanding limits, about realizing that underestimating someone with experience can have consequences you're not prepared for. And as I looked at my son, I knew he had learned a lesson he would never forget. But of course, the story wasn't over yet. The tension wasn't fully released. There was still the matter of what would happen once we docked, once the fog lifted completely, and once Ethan had to face the consequences of his misjudgments. That's the thing about panic, about mistakes made in haste. Even when corrected, they leave a mark. And as we prepared to approach Sausalito, I could already feel the next chapter of this morning's disaster beginning to unfold. The ferry ride to Sausalito should have taken 25 peaceful minutes. Instead, it felt like sitting inside a pressure cooker full of bad decisions. Ethan stayed near the rear cabin window, pacing in short, nervous bursts while pretending not to look at me. Every 30 seconds, he'd run a hand through his hair, check his phone, then glance toward the dock approaching through the fog. Classic panic loop. Margaret stood near the cabin entrance, speaking quietly into her radio, while Sam occupied himself by grading ferry coffee, like a disappointed food critic. "This tastes like somebody described coffee to water from another room," he muttered. "You continue finding new ways to insult beverages," I said. "It's a spiritual gift." That earned the smallest smile from Ethan despite everything. And honestly, that hurt more than if he'd stayed angry. Because for one split second, I saw my kid again. Not the desperate man tangled up in financial problems. Just Ethan, the little boy who once laughed so hard at a seagull stealing French fries that milk came out of his nose at Fisherman's Wharf in 1998. Memory is cruel like that. It interrupts your anger at the worst possible moments, But underneath that softness, my instincts kept screaming. Something still wasn't right. I sat down slowly across from Ethan and placed my navy duffel bag beside my boots. The yellow notebook remained safely inside. Untouched. At least mostly untouched. I already knew Ethan had flipped through it. The pages weren't aligned properly anymore. Most people would never notice that. I noticed immediately. "You opened it from the back first," I said calmly. Ethan froze. "What?" "The notebook. You started from the last section." Silence. "You folded page corners too," I continued. "You always do that when you're rushing." Sam looked between us. "That's unsettlingly specific. I told you Margaret said from nearby. He notices everything." Now Ethan looked genuinely shaken. Not because I caught him, because he realized how much I'd already figured out. You need to understand something important here. People assume intelligence is about talking loudly or sounding impressive. It's not. Real intelligence is patience, observation, knowing when somebody's lying before they finish the sentence. And Ethan had spent his whole life assuming quiet people were harmless. That was his biggest mistake. The ferry horn blasted low across the bay as Sausalito docks came into view through the fog. Margaret's radio crackled immediately. Then her face hardened. That got my attention fast. "What happened?" I asked. She lowered the radio slowly. Harbor Patrol reached the dock office, and the two men Ethan met with left 5 minutes before officers arrived. Of course they did. Men like that always move early once situations feel unstable. "Did they identify them?" I asked. Margaret nodded once. Dock cameras caught partial plates. One vehicle registered through a holding company connected to Oakland Freight Leasing. That made Ethan pale instantly. You know that look people get when reality finally punches through denial. "That one." He sat down heavily across from me. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I know." "No, you don't understand. I thought they were investors." I studied him carefully. And here's the thing, I believed him. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Ethan wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was something much sadder. A desperate man pretending to be smarter than his desperation. "There's a difference." "Tell me everything," I said quietly. He rubbed both hands over his face hard enough to leave red marks. "A guy named Victor contacted me 2 months ago after one of my logistics presentations," he admitted. "Said he worked with commercial shipping acquisitions." I nodded slowly. "Go on." "He knew about your career somehow. Said old transportation records sometimes helped investors identify hidden port opportunities." Sam muttered under his breath. "Oh, that's definitely illegal." "Very." I agreed. Ethan swallowed hard. At first it sounded legitimate. They talked about warehouse redevelopment around Alameda, old freight corridors, commercial zoning. He looked down at the floor. Then they started asking questions about historical investigations. And instead of walking away, I needed money. There it was. The honest sentence, not polished, not defensive, just true. He looked exhausted suddenly. Older, somehow. "I'm behind on everything," he admitted quietly. "The condo, the company loans, credit cards." He laughed bitterly once. "Hell, I borrowed against my retirement account last year." I stayed silent. Not because I didn't care. Because sometimes people finally tell the truth only after silence gives them room to continue. "They promised one payment," Ethan whispered. "Just for copies of old shipping records. Enough to reset everything." "And you believed them?" I wanted to. That sentence sat between us heavily. Because haven't we all done that at least once? Believed something, mostly because we desperately needed it to be true. Outside the ferry windows, Sausalito Harbor drifted closer. Sunlight finally began burning through the fog in pale streaks across the water. And suddenly, I remembered another investigation from years earlier. Cargo theft operation. 3 dock workers. 1 accountant drowning in gambling debt. That accountant kept insisting he never meant for things to go that far. But desperation always goes farther than planned. Always. I leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, look at me." He did. "You were willing to leave your father stranded at a ferry terminal over paperwork." Pain flashed across his face immediately. "I know. No, I need you to really hear that sentence." He looked away. "That's the part you'll remember later," I continued softly. "Not the money. not the investors. That moment. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then Sam, because apparently God refuses to let that man stay serious longer than 90 seconds, cleared his throat dramatically. Well, he announced on the bright side, this is still less embarrassing than Ethan's high school mustache phase. Ethan blinked. What? Oh, don't act like you forgot. Sam pointed proudly. You look like a substitute geography teacher going through a divorce. And against all logic, Ethan laughed, short, broken, exhausted, but real. Even I laughed a little. That moment mattered more than people realize, because anger hardens people. Laughter cracks them open again. Margaret approached carefully. We're docking in 3 minutes, she said. Harbor Patrol wants statements from everyone. Ethan immediately tensed again. You're not under arrest, she added calmly, but you need to cooperate fully. He nodded weakly, then looked at me. And for the first time all morning, I saw genuine shame instead of defensiveness. Dad, he said quietly, I really am sorry. Now here's where people expect dramatic speeches, big emotional confrontations, movie dialogue. Life rarely works that way. The truth is, betrayal usually leaves people tired more than angry. And sitting there watching my son unravel in front of me, I mostly felt sad. Sad that fear and pride had dragged him this far. Sad that he'd mistaken my quietness for weakness. Sad that somewhere along the way, he stopped believing he could ask for help honestly. I reached down and unzipped the side pocket of my duffel bag. Then I pulled out the sealed envelope, the one he never knew existed. Ethan stared immediately. What's that? Something you were too distracted to notice. I handed it to him calmly. His hands shook opening it. Inside was a cashier's check. $48,000. His eyes widened instantly. What? Your mother left it before she died, I said quietly. Strict instructions. He looked completely stunned. She knew you'd eventually get yourself into financial trouble because you inherited my stubbornness and her terrible decision-making in men. Even Margaret laughed at that. I continued. She told me not to give it to you unless you truly needed help. Ethan stared at the check like it physically hurt him. You had this the whole time. Yes, then why didn't you tell me? And that right there, that was the real question underneath everything. I looked directly at him because I needed to know whether you'd ask for help or betray people trying to avoid asking. Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that changes families permanently. And as the ferry finally bumped gently against the Sausalito dock, I think my son understood exactly how badly he'd failed that test. Docking at Sausalito felt almost surreal that morning. The sun had burned off enough fog to show the harbor in all its pastel glory boats, bobbing gently gulls circling tourists, wandering along the boardwalk like they'd never experienced tension in their lives. It was beautiful calm, almost cruelly peaceful considering the storm we'd just navigated on that ferry. I stepped off first, my navy duffel bag secured over my shoulder. Sam followed, still chewing what appeared to be the third bacon sandwich of the morning, muttering something about how crises always bring out his appetite. Margaret brought up the rear, authoritative yet calm eyes, scanning the dock for potential threats or lingering surprises. Ethan was behind me, walking hesitantly, head lowered, shoulders stiff, and hands awkwardly stuffed into his pockets. The man looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, but somehow diminished by the gravity of his own errors. That's the thing about reckoning, it shrinks arrogance quickly. We reached the pier exit, and Margaret gestured to a quiet corner near the ferry office. We'll talk here, she said firmly. No distractions, no unnecessary witnesses. I nodded, appreciating the order she brought into this chaos. Even with my investigative instincts, it's hard to manage human panic without someone orchestrating the scene with precision. Ethan swallowed hard and glanced at me, his eyes betraying confusion and shame. Dad, He started voice catching. I held up a hand. No, not yet. First we need context. I gestured to my duffel bag. Everything you think you need, all the decisions you made today are in there. But you're going to tell me why you did what you did, starting from the top, honestly. He swallowed again, looking at the bag as if it were a bomb. I didn't know how else to... His words trailed off. That's exactly the problem, I said softly. You didn't know how else to manage your fears, so you acted impulsively, panicked, misjudged people, assumed you could control things that were already out of your control. Sam, leaning casually against a post, piped up with a grin. In other words, you jumped headfirst into a pool you didn't check for water first. Ethan let out a weak, humorless laugh. I guess that's one way to put it. I sat down on the dock bench, motioning for him to sit beside me. He hesitated, then did, keeping the duffel bag awkwardly at his feet. I opened the side pocket, pulling out the envelope his mother had left before she passed. $48,000 untouched, waiting. I held it loosely in my hand. Do you see this? I asked. This was never about the money. It was about responsibility. About understanding that sometimes asking for help is stronger than trying to appear capable when you're drowning. He stared at the check mouth slightly open, realizing the magnitude of what had been available to him all along. You had this the whole time. Yes, but I needed to see if you'd rely on arrogance or judgment, on fear or honesty. I let the words hang between us, knowing that no lecture could convey the complexity of experience in one sentence. Margaret, still observing quietly, nodded approvingly. Sometimes the hardest lessons aren't taught, they're demonstrated. And thankfully no one was hurt in the process. I smiled faintly at her professionalism, then turned to Ethan. Do you understand why I didn't intervene sooner? I had to let you experience the full scope of your choices. Actions have consequences, even when people love you. He nodded, head bowed. I get it. I screwed up. I thought I was helping. I didn't realize how reckless I was being. You thought you were clever, I said. But desperation clouds judgment, especially when you believe a shortcut will fix everything. I gestured toward the harbor, the blue water stretching toward the Golden Gate Bridge, sunlight dancing across the waves. You've learned something today. Hopefully something you won't forget. He swallowed again, visibly shaken. I will. Dad, I promise. I reached over and placed my hand on his shoulder. I know you will. And I'm here to help you pick up the pieces. But you have to be honest. No shortcuts, no half-truths, no arrogance. For a moment, silence enveloped us. The distant sounds of gulls, ferry horns, and morning chatter filled the space. And then Sam, ever the irreverent, muttered, "This is nice and all, but I feel like you two are going to turn into one of those lifelong therapy cases if we don't eat something soon." We all laughed softly. Humor, even in tense moments, has a remarkable way of easing the weight of guilt and fear. Ethan looked at the envelope again, finally letting himself smile faintly. I guess Mom was smarter than both of us combined. You're catching on, I said. Better late than never. Margaret cleared her throat. Now that the family lesson is underway, let's make sure everyone is safe and accounted for. Ethan, you're going to cooperate fully with the harbor staff to finalize the documentation. Valor. Sam will ensure your duffel bag remains secure. Ethan nodded, shoulders still tense, but more composed than before. The crisis was not over completely, but the worst had passed. As we walked toward the ferry office to complete the formalities, I thought about the strange twists of parenthood. How patience, observation, and quiet experience can guide even the most reckless child toward understanding. How mistakes, when tempered with compassion, can become lessons. How moments of humor and levity can break the tension when emotions threaten to consume you entirely. Sam nudged me as we entered the office. You handled that like a pro. Though I still think the bacon sandwiches help more than anything. Probably, I said, smiling. Probably. Ethan approached the desk to speak with terminal staff, looking smaller than he did just an hour ago. Not broken, but humbled. Not defeated, but aware. And that, I realized, is a victory worth more than any money, any notebook, or any ferry schedule. I retrieved my duffel bag, checked the contents quickly, everything intact. Even the yellow notebook carefully folded as always, ready to document the next round of human mistakes. As we finally stepped outside, sunlight fully piercing the morning haze, I felt the warmth of the moment. Not perfection, not resolution of all problems, but a sense of progress. A sense that even through mistakes, panic, and foolishness, people could learn, grow, and reconnect. Ethan looked at me, finally truly meeting my gaze. Thanks, Dad, for letting me mess up, and then helping me see why it mattered. I nodded. That's the deal. We all make mistakes. It's how you respond that counts. Margaret approached with a reassuring nod while Sam continued to inspect the waterfront, like a tourist turned sleuth muttering about breakfast items yet to be tried. In that moment, I realized something important: the day wasn't perfect. Not by a long shot. There were still conversations to have, mistakes to reconcile, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time that morning, the chaos felt manageable. The panic had subsided. The lessons were clear. And I knew no matter what happened next, we had survived the storm together. We stepped off the ferry. The sun had fully burned off the fog. Sausalito sparkled like a postcard. Boats bobbed lazily, gulls circled overhead, and tourists wandered as though nothing terrible had just happened. Ethan followed behind me. His shoulders were tight, his hands fidgeted. Every step was hesitant. He was a man who had just learned how small he truly was. Sam walked beside me, hands in his pockets, smirking like he had front row seats to the morning's disaster. So he said, "Your son almost abandoned you and nearly got himself into legal hell." Wholesome day, huh? I didn't answer. I just adjusted the strap of my navy duffel bag. Every notebook inside was intact, every envelope safe. My secrets, my notes protected. Ethan stopped walking and looked at me. The blue in his eyes seemed dimmer, clouded by shame. "Dad," I held up a hand. "Not yet." He exhaled sharply. "This morning," I said slowly, "you left me stranded. You assumed I wouldn't notice. You assumed I'd be helpless. And for a moment you were right. But then I nodded toward Margaret, still standing near the ferry entrance, eyes sharp as ever. You realized you had underestimated people who've survived worse than panic and greed." Ethan's gaze dropped to the deck beneath our feet. I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. "I thought I could handle it." "You didn't handle it," I said. Short, firm. "True. You panicked. You acted without thought. And you used your father's name thinking it would give you leverage." A heavy silence followed. Sam, as always, broke it. "Honestly, the morning could have been worse. But it's already hilarious. You just don't see it yet, Ethan." Ethan managed a weak laugh, the kind that barely escapes when your chest is tight with regret. I didn't laugh. I didn't need to. The weight of betrayal and relief settled in a careful balance. "Your mistakes," I continued, "aren't just yours. They ripple. They affect people who care about you, who have spent decades noticing patterns that others ignore." He nodded almost imperceptibly. "I get it. You're going to have to do more than get lucky from now on. You'll need to prove yourself, not to me, not to anyone else. To yourself." Ethan's hands clenched the duffel bag at his feet. The envelope from his mother rested safely inside, untouched. $48,000. Waiting, a gift and a warning. "You had this the whole time?" he asked, voice cracking slightly. "Yes," I said. "But you had to see the consequences of your actions first. Otherwise, you wouldn't have learned anything." He swallowed. I understand. I didn't know how much I was relying on luck and shortcuts." "Exactly." I gestured toward the harbor. "Desperation blinds people. Greed encourages mistakes. Pride ensures they won't ask for help until it's almost too late." Sam, chewing the last bite of his sandwich, muttered under his breath, "Lesson 1, don't underestimate old men with notebooks." Ethan laughed quietly, a faint sound that carried more relief than joy. I let him sit there with the weight of the morning pressing on him, let him feel it fully. Margaret cleared her throat. "Now that you've seen what panicked decisions lead to, let's make sure no further mistakes occur. Ethan, you cooperate fully with harbor staff to finalize paperwork. Valor, your belongings remain secured. Everyone's safe." He nodded. Small, humble, human. I finally looked him in the eye. "You realize why I didn't intervene sooner? Because you wanted me to learn," he asked softly. "Yes, but also because you underestimated me. And now you've seen the difference between arrogance and quiet experience." Ethan's head dropped, shame heavy in his shoulders. "I'll do better," he said. "I promise." "You will," I replied. "And you'll remember this morning." That's the start. The ferry horn echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder that time moves forward, consequences remain, and redemption requires action, not just regret. I glanced at Sam. "Anything to add?" He smirked. "Yeah. Breakfast still matters. Never forget bacon sandwiches in a crisis." I shook my head, smiling faintly. Humor the quiet glue holding fractured mornings together. We walked along the boardwalk, sunlight glinting across the rippling harbor. Ethan finally spoke again. Dad, thank you for not rescuing me too soon, for letting me feel the weight of it. You needed it, I said. And now you know what it feels like to be caught between greed and reality, to be cornered by consequences and learn humility. Margaret nodded approvingly. And remember, fear teaches lessons, but reflection solidifies them. He looked at the envelope again, reverence in his hands, understanding in his eyes. I won't forget this, he whispered. Good, I said, because the consequences of recklessness don't disappear overnight. You've got to live with what you've learned and act accordingly from now on. We continued down the pier. The harbor was calm, peaceful, deceptively so. The lessons of the morning weren't finished. Relationships weren't fully healed. Trust had to be rebuilt. But there was progress, enough to feel cautiously optimistic, enough to know that even through panic, greed, and mistakes, growth is possible. I glanced at Ethan, smaller than before, humbled, not broken, not defeated, but aware. Dad, I'll make it right, he said, voice low but determined. That's a start, I replied. Step by step, no shortcuts. Sam nudged him, and maybe eat more sandwiches along the way. We laughed softly. Not everything was perfect. Not every mistake could be undone. But honesty, accountability, and quiet reflection had restored the first threads of connection. Ethan looked at the harbor once more, then at me. Thanks for letting me learn the hard way. Lesson's not over yet, I said. But you've survived the first round. That counts. And as sunlight glinted across the water, I felt a quiet sense of victory. Not a complete resolution, not a perfect ending, but a beginning. The morning had been chaos, panic, betrayal, and quiet reckoning. And yet in the aftermath, we found connection, awareness, humility, and most importantly, the understanding that actions have consequences even when wrapped in family love and expectation. Life lessons from today. Greed and panic cloud judgment. Experience and patience cut through both. Mistakes are powerful teachers if faced honestly. Honesty, humility, and accountability rebuild trust stronger than shortcuts or arrogance ever could. Humor and human connection prevent despair from consuming the lessons. Some lessons only stick when consequences are felt, not explained. If this story meant something to you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been in a situation like this? We read every single one, and as always, thank you for being a part of this.